Hey guys, tonight we're stepping away from the glowing screens, the relentless scroll of notifications, and the jangling worries of tomorrow's to-do list, and instead we're walking together into the dust and silence of the Indus River plain. The air feels heavy with warmth, the kind of late evening heat that lingers after the sun has long disappeared behind low hills. Ahead, there's a city so old it predates most of the ruins you usually picture, older than the Parthenon, older than Rome, older even than the pyramids of Giza in their prime. Its bricks are sun-baked, its streets unnervingly straight, and it feels like a place out of time. You probably won't survive here, to be honest. There's no pizza delivery, no mosquito repellent strong enough, and definitely no Netflix buffering in the background, but that's not why we've come. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, tell me where you're tuning in from and what time it is right now. I love seeing that tapestry of places and hours stretch across the comments. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You shuffle closer across a parched track until you stand at the edge of what archaeologists named Mohenjo-Daro, the Mound of the Dead. The name sounds spooky, but it's a modern invention given long after the city's own people vanished into history without leaving a single Rosetta Stone behind. Around you, the ruins stretch in orderly lines, brick walls, just chest-high foundations peeking out like ribs of a giant skeleton. Unlike the chaotic clusters of huts you might expect from such deep antiquity here, everything feels measured, purposeful, clean. It's like stepping into a ghostly version of a downtown grid. The first impression is eerie. Imagine wandering into a place where all the buildings are trimmed down to their bases, yet still you can sense the precision. The lanes run straight, crossing each other like graph paper. You walk one way and hit a junction that leads you neatly left or right, all at perfect right angles. It's as though someone with a giant ruler and a stubborn love of neatness designed this town. Modern urban planners could take notes if they were willing to accept a few goats and carts jamming the intersections. Your feet scuff on the dusty ground and you picture what it would have felt like 3,000 or 4,000 years ago. The smell of damp clay bricks baking under the sun. Smoke rising from hearths as evening meals simmer, lentils, flatbreads, maybe some grilled river fish if the catch was good. Voices carry down the alleys, neighbors calling across rooftops. You might even hear the rhythmic tap of a beadmaker chipping at carnelian or the splash of someone hauling water from a deep well. Life, in other words, was bustling here, even if it feels frozen now. One mainstream historical fact jumps out right at the start. Mohenjo-Daro was one of the principal settlements of the Indus Valley civilization, a society flourishing roughly between 2600 and 1900 BCE. That's contemporary with Old Kingdom Egypt and Sumerian Mesopotamia, though these Indus people left behind fewer obvious monuments. No gigantic stone statues, no bombastic tombs with treasure, just neat cities built with small, standardized bricks. It's civilization without ego, or at least without the kind of ego that requires pyramids to prove it. But here's the quirky tidbit. You wouldn't expect some early excavators in the 1920s insisted on calling Mohenjo-Daro the most hygienic city of the ancient world. Not because it had mint-scented toothpaste or herbal deodorant shops, but because nearly every house seemed to have a bathroom and a drainage chute. That kind of luxury wouldn't be standard again until modern plumbing. So, yes, you might be sweating buckets in the Indus heat, but at least you could wash off the dust with a little splash of cool well water. And right away, one of the open scholarly debates floats to the surface. Historians still argue whether Mohenjo-Daro was run by a centralized authority, a council of elders, or simply a kind of loosely organized merchant society. There are no kingly statues, no warrior palaces, no obvious throne rooms. Power is strangely invisible here. Was it a utopia of civic cooperation, or are we simply blind to how they expressed authority? The ruins don't answer, and so every footstep you take feels like walking across a puzzle board. You imagine yourself entering one of the main streets. Evening light slants low, catching the reddish tint of the baked bricks. The path is wide enough for carts, though right now it's empty, save for your solitary shadow stretching out like a long finger. You pause by a rectangular depression ahead, at first glance just another hole in the ruins, but archaeologists think it was once a well. Picture it: bustling rope, creaking jars, clinking children, squabbling for turns as mothers scoop up water. The stone lining is still visible, smooth from centuries of use. If you close your eyes, you might hear the faint echoes of language, except that the actual Indus script remains unreadable to us. Those murmured syllables could mean anything. Traders, haggling priests, chanting lovers, whispering on the rooftops. The absence of understanding adds to the dreamy unreality, like trying to watch a movie with the subtitles stuck on nonsense characters. And while you're lost in those imagined sounds, here's a playful thought: if you wanted to complain to the city council about noisy neighbors or a pothole in the street, how would you even write it down? We have no clue. Their symbols are tiny, often just a handful per seal, so for all we know the city's equivalent of graffiti could have been witty insults about bad bread or goats running loose. The night air thickens, stars emerge above, faint at first, and then bright in the desert clarity. The Milky Way arches across the black sky, just as it must have then. You realize this was the same dome of light the people of Mohenjo-Daro saw every evening as they wound down from their chores. Maybe they lay on rooftops staring up, just as you are now pointing out constellations and making up myths that will never recover. Their entire worldview, politics, spirituality, jokes slipped away like smoke. As you wander between walls, your mind drifts back to that cheeky modern reminder you really wouldn't last long here. Without bug sprays, sunscreen, or a steady Wi-Fi connection, you'd be the weird outsider, mumbling in a foreign tongue and probably burning your feet on hot bricks. Yet there's something comforting in knowing that the city itself, quiet and broken as it is, still stands. The bricks hold the memory of hands long gone, the drains still hint at water's rush, and the wells still promise depth. You reach a quiet corner of the site away from the main grid, where the mounds slope down into shadow. Here the silence is thick, but not empty. It feels as though the city hums softly beneath your feet, whispering that its stories aren't entirely lost. They're just waiting for you to lean closer, to listen with patience, to walk slowly through the dust and wonder. The ground crunches softly beneath your sandals as you keep exploring, and now the story shifts, not to the life of Mohenjo-Daro's citizens, but to the moment this whole buried city returned to the world's awareness. Because for nearly 4,000 years after its decline, no one outside of local folklore really knew it had ever existed. Just a mound of brick and dust beside the Indus, baking under the sun, occasionally pillaged for building material. Imagine walking past the ruins in the 1800s, just another anonymous rise in the plains, not a clue that it held the remains of a lost civilization. Fast forward to the 1920s, when British colonial authorities were expanding railway lines across the region. Labourers dug into the mound for bricks, solid, well-shaped ones, easy to pry loose. It was like a free hardware store of ancient construction material. Only when scholars began noticing just how regular these bricks were, each one almost exactly the same size, fired to the same hardness, did curiosity start to spark. Railways may have literally stolen part of the site, but that theft also nudged archaeologists into paying attention. Enter John Marshall, the Director General of the Archaeological Survey of India. Under his watch, systematic excavations began, and soon the shape of a vast forgotten city emerged. The neat street grid, the drainage lines, the deep wells, every new trench widened the sense that this was no mere village. Suddenly, textbooks around the world needed a new chapter. The Indus Valley civilization joined Mesopotamia and Egypt in the pantheon of first great urban cultures. But here's a quirky twist: early reports didn't call it Mohenjo-Daro at all. Some officials casually referred to it as the Harappa culture because another site called Harappa had been uncovered around the same time. For years, schoolchildren read about Harappan civilization as though Mohenjo-Daro was its sidekick, not one of the stars of the show. Imagine discovering New York and Los Angeles, but only naming the culture after Des Moines It's got a certain charm, but it feels a bit off. And of course, historians still argue whether Marshall and his team got too excited too quickly. Some critics point out that the rush to label Mohenjo-Daro as a highly advanced, orderly society may have leaned on projecting modern values back into the past. Was every street really so precisely planned, or were archaeologists smoothing over messy irregularities in their reconstructions? Excavation can be a bit like detective work, except the crime scene has been eroded, looted, and half swallowed by the river for millennia. You picture those early archaeologists in their sun hats scribbling notes in leather journals while local workers hauled basket after basket of soil. The air must have been thick with dust, the sort that sticks to your throat and makes you crave water constantly. Every brick uncovered felt like peeling away a secret. And at night, in canvas tents pitched near the dig lamps glowed, while experts argued over whether this was just another forgotten town or something far more monumental. One mainstream fact anchors this moment: the announcement of Mohenjo-Daro's discovery in 1924 genuinely stunned the academic world. For the first time, people realized there had been a third great civilization alongside Egypt and Mesopotamia, and equal in scale and sophistication, but previously invisible in the Western canon. That's like suddenly learning your family has an entire set of cousins you'd never met who had been living their best lives all along. Now, for a fringe tidbit, in the early days, some writers speculated that Mohenjo-Daro might be connected to the biblical city of Sodom, destroyed by divine fire. Others claimed it was proof of Atlantis's Asian outpost. These ideas were more pulp magazine than peer-reviewed journal, but they captured imaginations. It's proof that whenever something ancient and mysterious pops up, humans can't resist weaving it into their favorite myths, no matter how far-fetched. And once again, a scholarly debate rises like desert mirage. Historians still argue whether Mohenjo-Daro was the capital of the Indus world, a true hub of political control, or simply one large city among several peers like Harappa Dolavira and Lothal. The ruins don't contain royal inscriptions or ostentatious palaces that would make the hierarchy obvious. Instead, all we see are wide streets, efficient drains, and standardized bricks. It leaves the question hanging: who really held the reins of this urban experiment? As you walk among the ruins tonight, imagine the diggers of a century ago doing the same, except with shovels and notebooks instead of sleepy wonder. They tripped over walls, puzzled at the Great Bath, and sketched maps of streets that hadn't echoed with footsteps in thousands of years. What must it have felt like to realize you'd stumbled onto one of the earliest blueprints of city life? It's like opening an attic and finding not just your grandmother's letters, but an entire forgotten library no one told you existed. Even now, under the moonlight, the site has the quiet authority of something that never really asked to be rediscovered. The bricks don't care who named them, who catalogued them, or who now argues over their meaning. They just sit in their measured lines, stubbornly enduring the centuries, whispering through silence rather than speech. And you, lucky enough to be walking here in imagination, get to hear that whisper carried through time. You move deeper into the city and it strikes you how the very bones of Mohenjo-Daro still reveal its secret obsession order. Unlike so many ancient settlements that grew haphazardly around a riverbank or a fort, this place feels planned from the ground up. Imagine a giant, invisible architect hovering above, ruler in hand, saying, "No, make the streets cross here, make the houses line up there, and for heaven's sake, keep those bricks all the same size." The layout is simple yet stunning. The city was divided into two main parts, the Citadel Mound to the west and the lower town to the east. The Citadel, raised on a massive platform of mud brick, hosted the big public buildings, the Great Bath granaries and assembly halls. Meanwhile, the lower town stretched out in a neat grid home to thousands of people living in houses that looked remarkably similar. No palace towers over the rest, no monument screams out one person's ego. Instead, it's civic design as a collective project. A mainstream historical fact here is worth pausing on. Mohenjo-Daro's streets are laid out on a north-south and east-west grid, with main avenues up to 10 meters wide. Side streets branched off at right angles, almost like blocks in Manhattan, except without the hot dog carts and honking taxis. It's one of the earliest examples of urban planning on such a grand scale, showing that this wasn't a city that just happened, it was one carefully thought through. But there's also a quirky tidbit. Archaeologists noticed that most bricks follow a precise 1:4 ratio height-width-length. That's ancient Lego-level standardization. It meant walls, drains, and staircases could be slotted together with minimal fuss. Some scholars even joke that the Indus Valley masons would have made great IKEA designers. Everything flat-packed, everything modular, everything some assembly required. Only here there were no tiny Allen wrenches. Of course, historians still argue whether this kind of urban order meant there was a centralized government enforcing it, or whether communities simply shared building traditions and copied each other. Was there some Indus Valley equivalent of a city inspector striding down the street with a clay tablet checklist tutting at any crooked drainpipe? Or was it more like a shared cultural instinct, a deeply ingrained habit of building things the proper way? The debate hasn't been settled because the city left no rulebooks behind. You stroll along one of the broad avenues, and though the walls barely reach your shoulders now, you can imagine them taller, shading the lane in narrow slits of sun. You turn into a side street, narrower, hemmed in by long rows of homes. Each doorway faces the road opening into private courtyards. The city's rhythm becomes clearer with every step. Public life on the wide streets, domestic life tucked neatly away behind orderly walls. There's something soothing about the geometry even now. Straight lines, right angles, repeating units of space. It almost feels modern, like a quiet suburb, frozen in red brick. If you weren't told how old it was, you might think you'd stumbled onto a medieval town carefully surveyed, or maybe even a newer neighborhood built with the bare minimum of architectural flair. The difference is that Mohenjo-Daro had this neatness when many parts of the world were still mostly farmland dotted with huts. And then your eyes drift back to the citadel mound. It rises above the lower town like a guardian plateau, its mud brick base still visible, though crumbling. Climb up in your mind and you'd find open courtyards, pillared halls, and that famous great bath waiting ahead. Down below the city hums with orderly energy markets in squares, children darting across alleys, potter's wheels, spinning in corners. Up here, the architecture becomes monumental, not for one person, but for the community itself. The open scholarly debate lingers like background music. Why so much order? Was it born of necessity, flood management perhaps, or defensive clarity? Or was it ideology, a collective belief that the world itself should be arranged into neat rectangles? Historians still argue whether we're seeing practical engineering or spiritual symbolism in the bricks and blocks. And since the Indus people left no decipherable texts, the question remains suspended like a riddle, scratched into stone, and then erased by time. By now, the night sky above the ruins feels broader, darker. A breeze sneaks in from the river carrying the scent of silt and faintly damp clay. You walk the straight street one more time, savoring the quiet rhythm of your steps. If you close your eyes, you could almost convince yourself you're following the same paths as merchants, priests, children and masons, thousands of years ago, all moving to the same grid, the same unseen design. The city holds its silence, yet it also hums with an echo of purpose, a whisper of intent. And even in that hush, you can't help but chuckle at the thought if the residents really did have some kind of urban planning council, those meetings must have been legendary for their efficiency. Imagine it. Any new business, no excellent. Another row of bricks at a 1:4 ratio, everyone. Meeting adjourned. You climb the slope of the citadel mound in your mind's eye, feeling the soft crunch of clay and the ghostly outline of baked bricks underfoot. Up here, the city's public heart once pulsed. This wasn't just the higher ground against floods, it was the stage for ritual gatherings and the spaces that made Mohenjo-Daro more than a cluster of houses. And at the center of this ridge lies one of the most iconic features of the entire Indus world, the Great Bath. Picture it, a massive rectangular pool about 12 meters long, 7 meters wide, and over 2 meters deep. The walls are made of baked brick, carefully sealed with bitumen to keep the water in. A flight of steps descends into the pool from either end, and a drainage hole suggests it could be emptied and cleaned. This isn't a casual puddle, it's a carefully engineered basin more sophisticated than most swimming pools you'll find in someone's backyard today. A mainstream historical fact sets the tone. The Great Bath is often considered the earliest known public water tank in the world. Archaeologists are almost certain it was used for communal purposes, perhaps ritual bathing or ceremonies. And while nobody carved a plaque saying, "Welcome to the Mohenjo-Daro Community Center, please remove your sandals before entering," the deliberate construction speaks volumes. This was a shared place, a collective focus. But here's the quirky tidbit. Some scholars have joked that the Great Bath might have been the Indus Valley's version of a luxury spa. Imagine citizens lining up with clay mugs of barley beer, gossiping about bead prices and complaining about the heat while soaking their dust off. Of course, we'll never know if it was solemn purification or playful splashing, but either way, the idea of a 4,000-year-old hot tub club is irresistible. And here's where the scholarly debate slides in like ripples across the water. Historians still argue whether the Great Bath was truly for religious ritual, for civic meetings, or simply a way to keep cool in the scorching Indus summers. Some lean towards spiritual cleansing, citing later Hindu traditions of sacred rivers and bathing rituals. Others suggest it may have been about civic identity, stepping into the pool as an act of belonging. Without inscriptions or instructions, the purpose remains suspended in shimmering mystery. You wander further along the Citadel Ridge. Besides the bath, you pass the remains of what archaeologists call granaries, long halls with brick platforms thought to have stored grain. But here too, the certainty cracks. Were they granaries, or were they assembly halls, or even marketplaces under shade? Some researchers wonder whether the very word granary was a hasty label by early excavators eager to match Indus ruins with Mesopotamian parallels. You almost hear the ghost of John Marshall muttering, "Well, it looks storagey enough," while scribbling the word into his notebook. Even if we're not sure what every building did, the Citadel gives the impression of shared resources, collective effort, and public life. You picture festivals here with vendors hawking dates and lentil stew, musicians plucking at stringed instruments, and children darting between stalls. Maybe, just maybe, processions moved past the Great Bath, the sound of drums bouncing off brick walls, the scent of oil lamps mixing with the river breeze. The mound wasn't just mud and stone. It was where the community gathered to be more than the sum of its houses. As you sit on a crumbled ledge, the night air cools. A faint breeze runs along the citadel, carrying the earthy scent of baked clay. From here, the city below stretches into dark silence, its grid neat even in ruin. And for a moment you can imagine the place alive, lanterns glowing on rooftops, voices rising in the lanes, and the Great Bath shimmering with torchlight as people descend the steps, water rippling around them. The beauty is that you don't have to decide whether it was a ritual or a spa. The ambiguity is part of the lullaby. Like so many aspects of Mohenjo-Daro, the answer has slipped just out of reach, leaving only the cool echo of water and the rhythm of bricks. And in that gentle uncertainty, the city feels even more dreamlike, like a riddle whispered across 4,000 years. One last joke before you leave this lofty space. If the Great Bath really was a spa, someone somewhere must have been the ancient equivalent of a lifeguard. Picture a very stern Indus elder at the pool's edge, blowing into a hollow reed whistle and shouting, "No running on the steps." You step down from the citadel into the neat avenues again, but your gaze drops lower past the crumbling walls and into the veins of the city itself. Because if Mohenjo-Daro is remembered for anything beyond its mysterious script, it's the plumbing. Yes, really. When people talk about the cradle of civilization, they rarely imagine bathroom drains, but here, sanitation wasn't just an afterthought. It was built into the very bones of the city. As you walk, you notice narrow channels running alongside the streets, brick-lined and neatly covered with slabs. Every so often a gap appears, an ancient manhole of sorts where someone could peer in or clear a blockage. This was no random ditch dug after the fact. It was planned, executed and maintained. In other words, Mohenjo-Daro was rocking covered sewers 3,500 years before London even thought about it. A mainstream historical fact is plain as day. Nearly every house had its own bathing area, often with a sloped floor leading into a small drain which then fed into the larger street sewers. Private hygiene wasn't just a luxury for the elite, it seems to have been expected of everyone. Compare that to medieval Europe, where people sometimes tossed chamber pots out the window and hoped gravity did the rest. If time travelers had to pick a place to live purely based on sanitation, the Indus Valley would win hands down. Now for the quirky tidbit, archaeologists have noted that some drains were so well built, you could almost imagine ancient plumbers earning their keep unclogging them. There's even evidence of brick inspection covers that could be lifted out. So yes, 4,000 years ago, somebody's job might have been to wriggle down a street drain with a stick, muttering about goat hair clogs. If you've ever called a plumber at midnight, just know that tradition has ancient roots. And as always, historians still argue whether this advanced water management reflected centralized control or simply shared know-how. Was there a civic office assigning drain cleaners, or did neighbors band together to clear blockages themselves, grumbling about the mess? Without records, we can only speculate. But the consistency of design across the city suggests something more than coincidence, some guiding principle that made sanitation a cornerstone of urban life. You pass a series of wells, over 700 have been found across Mohenjo-Daro. Many homes had private wells while others shared communal ones. Imagine the rhythm of life around them: ropes, squeaking buckets, sloshing voices rising and falling with gossip. The water table was generous here, fed by the Indus and its shifting channels, but it still took effort to sink and line so many shafts. Each well is like a promise carved into the earth that the city would endure as long as water flowed. The smell of damp clay hangs in your imagination. Picture rinsing off sweat in your little courtyard, water trickling down a slanted brick floor, disappearing neatly into the drain. For the residents, this wasn't luxury, it was normal life. Cleanliness wasn't an afterthought, it was woven into daily rhythms. You could almost envy that until you remember there were no showers with adjustable heat. It was just you, a jug, and maybe a friend warning you not to dump all the water in one go. The streets at night might have echoed with water too. The trickle of drains, the splash of rinsed jars, the faint burble of a nearby well. The whole city must have sounded alive with the movement of water, hidden, guided, controlled. It's oddly soothing to think of it, a 4,000-year-old lullaby of liquid through brick. Of course, the mystery remains. Why invest so much effort in drains and baths if, as far as we can tell, there were no massive palaces or flashy temples demanding resources? Historians still argue whether this emphasis on hygiene reflects some cultural obsession with purity or simply a pragmatic love of not stepping in puddles. Either way, Mohenjo-Daro feels strangely modern in this respect, a place where the water system was as important as the walls. As you pause by one of the street drains, you can't help but smile at the thought of a city meeting where the topic of discussion was Agenda Item 1, cleaning sludge. Agenda Item 2, don't let goats fall into the sewers again. Civic life, timeless and a little ridiculous. The streets fade into smaller lanes now, and you step through one of the low, crumbling thresholds into what was once a private home. It's not much taller than your shoulders now, but imagine the walls rising higher, plastered and painted, enclosing a space where daily life unfolded with quiet rhythm. If the citadel was the city's public heart, then these homes were its beating pulse, everyday spaces, where cooking fires smoked laughter, rose, and chores stretched out endlessly under the sun. Inside, the layout is surprisingly familiar. A small entry opens into a central courtyard open to the sky, with rooms arranged around it. You can almost hear the creak of wooden doors, the shuffle of sandals across packed earth floors. The courtyard would have been the stage for family life, children chasing each other in circles, women grinding grain on stone slabs, men mending tools or gossiping with neighbors leaning over shared walls. Life wasn't glamorous, but it was steady. Here's a mainstream historical fact: most houses in Mohenjo-Daro were built from those same standardized baked bricks, often 2 stories tall with flat roofs. Some had staircases suggesting that people used the roof spaces for storage work, or even sleeping in the cooler months. Rooftops weren't wasted, they were an extension of the household. Picture yourself up there on a warm evening, stretched on a woven mat, the stars flickering overhead, while smoke from cooking fires drifts upward. Now for a quirky tidbit, archaeologists discovered small terracotta figurines, often of women, sometimes with elaborate jewelry or hairstyles in the ruins of these homes. Were they toys, household goddesses, or just the Indus version of collectible action figures? No one can say for sure, but it's oddly comforting to know that even 4,000 years ago, people liked to leave little figurines lying around cluttering shelves, just like we do today. And here's the scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the people of Mohenjo-Daro lived in nuclear families, extended clans, or some form of shared households. The standardized homes suggest a certain social equality, but without decipherable texts, we can't tell who had authority inside the walls. Was the eldest male in charge? Did women run the households with quiet power? Were courtyards spaces of matriarchal ritual, or simply practical kitchens? The walls won't say, they only hold silence. You step across the threshold into what would have been a kitchen. Imagine the scent of lentils bubbling in a clay pot, the nutty aroma of grain roasting, the occasional tang of fish pulled from the Indus. Mortars and pestles grind rhythmically, pounding spices into paste. The family's goats shuffle in a corner pen, complaining about being tied up. From the rooftop, you hear the faint laughter of teenagers sneaking up to watch the street below. In another room, you spot the outline of a bathing space, a sloped brick floor leading into a private drain. Water from the household well would have been splashed here, rinsing away the sweat and dust. For the residents, this wasn't indulgence, it was daily necessity. Clean bodies, tidy courtyards, meals cooked and eaten together, the unglamorous but essential fabric of life. As the night deepens, you picture the home settling into quiet. The courtyard fire glows low, children curl up on reed mats. A parent hums softly, a tune lost to history, but timeless in its intent to soothe. Overhead, the roof is cool and inviting, and perhaps the eldest members of the family are already stretched out under the open stars, their breath slow, their eyes wandering constellations we still recognize. There's comfort in realizing that while empires rise and fall, while scripts vanish and debates rage, the rhythm of a household is eternal. Cooking, cleaning, sleeping, arguing, laughing. If you strip away the millennia, Mohenjo-Daro's homes feel strangely close to our own. And before you step back into the street, one last joke drifts in. If the Indus people really did use rooftops for sleeping, imagine the groggy complaints every morning. Oh, the neighbor's goat was bleating all night again. Someone invent earplugs already. You leave the quiet rhythm of the houses behind and drift toward the hum of the marketplace. Even in ruins you can sense it. The long stretch of open street widened into a kind of plaza where voices once tangled and where the air must have been thick with smoke, spice and bargaining. Mohenjo-Daro wasn't just a neat collection of homes, it was a hub pulsing with crafts and trade that reached astonishingly far beyond its baked brick streets. Picture bead makers hunched at their stalls working with tiny tools. Carnelian beads, those reddish translucent stones, were drilled with holes so precise that modern jewelers still raise their eyebrows at the craftsmanship. Shell bangles gleam pale in the sunlight, cut and polished, smooth, stacked in bundles ready for trade. Copper tools flash here and there, their edges sharpened for use in homes and workshops. Even small clay tokens, standardized in shape, hint at some system of accounting or exchange. Here's the mainstream historical fact: standardized weights and measures have been found across the Indus sites, often made of chert stone. They follow uniform ratios, suggesting a regulated trade system. This wasn't a city where everyone guessed how much grain was in a sack. Transactions were carefully balanced. It's one of the earliest glimpses of a regulated economy where fairness was baked into the scales. Now for the quirky tidbit. Archaeologists found evidence that some goods from Mohenjo-Daro ended up as far away as Mesopotamia. Imagine an Indus merchant squinting at a Sumerian customer, neither speaking the other's language, trying to haggle over a shipment of beads, hands waving numbers, scratched in dust, maybe a goat wandering through and complicating the deal. Ancient global trade, same confusion, same comedy, just slower boats, and the scholarly debate hums louder here. Historians still argue whether Mohenjo-Daro's economy was centrally managed by some authority, or whether it was a more free-flowing network of merchants and craftspeople. Were there overseers regulating production, or was it simply tradition that kept beadmakers and brickmakers following standards? Without decipherable records, we're left to piece together patterns from scattered workshops and uniform weights, like trying to reconstruct a symphony from a handful of notes. The market scene grows richer in your mind. Children weave through crowds chasing each other around baskets of dates. The smell of sesame oil wafts from food stalls where flatbreads puff on clay griddles. A potter sits cross-legged spinning a wheel with steady kicks, while nearby a metalworker hammers copper sheets into shape. Every sound, every smell, every sparkle of crafted goods feeds into the heartbeat of a city alive with exchange. And the trade wasn't just local. From the port city of Lothal Indus, merchants sent boats down the Arabian Sea, reaching the Persian Gulf. Overland caravans likely trudged westward toward Mesopotamia, carrying beads, cotton, textiles, and exotic woods. In return, Mesopotamian records mention a place called Meluha, thought by many to be the Indus region. To think of Mohenjo-Daro's goods crossing deserts and seas, ending up on the wrists of distant elites, gives the city a reach far larger than its quiet ruins suggest. As you stroll through the imagined marketplace, the bustle softens into the background. The lamps of stalls flicker, the voices of merchants blur into a murmur. You find yourself pausing by a beadmaker's stall, watching as he threads tiny carnelian discs into a necklace. His hands are steady, his expression calm, his craft honed by generations. It's a small act, but one that bound Mohenjo-Daro to the world beyond the Indus. And here's a small smile for the night. Imagine the universal frustration of haggling. 4,000 years ago, some tired merchant was surely rolling his eyes at a customer insisting, "Come on, throw in one more bead for free." Some traditions clearly are eternal. The marketplace fades behind you and your steps carry you toward one of Mohenjo-Daro's most remarkable features, the Great Bath. Even among the city's many mysteries, this rectangular pool carved from baked brick feels different, more deliberate, more symbolic. You stand at the edge of its crumbling walls, and even in silence you can almost hear the echo of water lapping feet, splashing voices lowered in reverence. The Great Bath is not massive by modern standards, about the size of a small swimming pool, but its construction is meticulous. Waterproof bitumen was pressed between bricks, stairs descended on both sides, and surrounding rooms suggested changing spaces or storerooms. This was no casual puddle. It was designed with care, intended to hold and release water with precision. Here's the mainstream historical fact: the Great Bath is widely considered the earliest known public water tank in the ancient world. That alone makes it extraordinary, a deliberate communal structure maintained for reasons beyond simple utility. Now for the quirky tidbit, some scholars have pointed out that the bath's design resembles ritual pools still used in South Asia today, from temple tanks to stepwells. It raises the question of whether echoes of Mohenjo-Daro's practices survived thousands of years, filtering into later traditions of purification. The idea that you might still see a cousin of this pool in modern India or Pakistan is oddly comforting, like a cultural ripple crossing millennia. But here's the scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the Great Bath was purely for religious ritual, a kind of ceremonial cleansing, or whether it had a more civic function, perhaps a place of communal gathering, even leisure. Was it sacred like a temple font, or secular like an ancient community center? The walls won't confirm it, leaving you to decide whether the people entered solemnly, chanting prayers, or joyfully splashing one another on hot afternoons. Imagine it both ways. By day, perhaps the pool is filled with children laughing, parents lowering themselves into the cool water, and traders pausing to wash the dust of travel from their bodies. By dusk, it transforms the water, darkens torches, flicker along the walls, and solemn figures descend the stairs, robes floating, whispering invocations to gods we no longer know. The same pool, two lives layered over one another, never fully revealing which was real. The setting itself adds to the intrigue. Around the Great Bath are buildings that may have been used for assembly or storage. Some archaeologists once suggested a priestly class managed the site, but without clear evidence of temples or palaces, it's hard to prove. Unlike Egypt or Mesopotamia, Mohenjo-Daro leaves us no giant statues, no boasting inscriptions. Its people built carefully but without the self-promotion of kings. And so in the quiet night, you imagine yourself standing barefoot on the bath's cool steps. You dip your toes into the imagined water ripples spreading in slow circles. The air smells faintly of baked earth and damp brick. Somewhere above the stars, reflect faintly in the surface the same constellations the city's builders must have seen. Perhaps rituals here were simple, maybe even private. A person could have descended at dawn, washed silently, and climbed out refreshed, believing themselves renewed. Or perhaps festivals filled the bath with chanting flowers and lamps floating like stars across the water. The truth is hidden, but the stillness of the pool makes you feel like you've brushed against something timeless, a human impulse toward cleansing both body and spirit. Before you move on, a light smile. Imagine explaining this to a modern tourist. So yes, it's a 4,000-year-old pool. No lifeguard on duty though, so swim at your own risk. You leave the echo of the Great Bath behind, winding deeper into the ruins until you find yourself staring at something both ordinary and extraordinary, the remains of wells and drains. At first glance, it's just broken brickwork, small round shafts plunging into the ground channels running along the streets. But pause here and you realize you're looking at one of the most sophisticated sanitation systems the ancient world had ever seen. Wells rise like brick chimneys scattered throughout neighborhoods. Many were private, built directly into homes, so families could draw water without stepping outside. Imagine lowering a clay jar, the cool splash echoing as it dips into the groundwater. In the heat of the Indus summer, that sound must have been the sweetest music. Then when the jar was hauled up, dripping and heavy water would flow into pots baths or cooking fires with ease. Here's the mainstream historical fact. Mohenjo-Daro had hundreds of wells, more than any other city of its time. And running alongside them, an elaborate drainage system carried wastewater away, covered with removable brick slabs so they could be cleaned. This wasn't haphazard, it was planned, engineered, maintained. Now for the quirky tidbit, archaeologists believe some drains were even flushed with water from nearby wells to prevent blockages. Yes, 4,000 years ago, people were already worried about clogged plumbing. Somewhere deep in time, someone sighed. Ugh, the drains backed up again, proving that household frustrations are eternal. And the scholarly debate remains. Historians still argue whether this sanitation system was centrally managed or maintained by individual households. Did some citywide authority oversee cleaning schedules, or was it more like each family keeping up their stretch of the drain? Either way, the system shows an astonishing level of civic cooperation. Imagine walking down one of these tidy lanes on a warm evening. The drains are covered, so you don't have to hop over foul puddles. The air smells not of waste, but of smoke spices, maybe even flowers drifting from courtyards. Water is drawn, carried, poured, drained, all part of the hum of daily life, woven so seamlessly into the city's rhythm that no one thought to boast about it. The thought makes you chuckle. Civilizations love to brag about pyramids, temples, and colossal statues, but ask anyone living there and they probably cared more about whether their drains worked. Imagine the Indus people rolling their eyes at a messy neighbor who neglected their stretch of channel. Come on, Kieran, it's your turn to lift the slabs. As you trace the line of a drain, you realize how revolutionary this was. Other civilizations, even centuries later, often struggled with sanitation. Mohenjo-Daro's system suggests a culture that prized not just grandeur, but comfort, cleanliness, and practicality. It feels oddly modern, almost relatable, as if the people here were saying, life is chaotic enough, let's at least keep the streets clean. The night air settles heavier around you. The wells stand like hollow sentinels, and for a moment you imagine drawing water yourself. The rope rough in your hands, the clay jar heavy against your chest. You tip it into an imaginary basin, watching the ripples fade. The silence returns, but it's filled with an invisible hum of ancient water, flowing steadily, quietly, sustaining life. And before you wander on, here's your sleepy grin for the night. If you ever feel annoyed by modern plumbing bills, just remember, at least you don't have to lift brick slabs and flush drains by hand like the folks of Mohenjo-Daro. The wells and drains slip behind you, and now your steps guide you toward quieter corners of the city, the workshops where artisans shaped the little treasures that gave Mohenjo-Daro its sparkle. It's easy to imagine the steady clink of tools, the hiss of heated metal, the scrape of carving stone. Even in the shadows, you can almost feel the pride of makers whose craft carried their city's name far beyond the Indus. In one workshop, beads take center stage. Carnelian stones glow like embers as they're drilled into tiny discs. Lapis lazuli, carried all the way from Afghanistan, gleams in deeper blues. Steatite is carved into delicate seals, pressed with animal motifs, and script-like signs no one alive today can fully read. Picture the artisan hunched over, turning a small square of stone until it's just right, the image of a unicorn or bull, stamped sharp enough to last millennia. Here's the mainstream historical fact. Thousands of seals have been found across the Indus Valley, often decorated with animals, elephants, tigers, rhinoceroses, and the mysterious unicorn. These weren't just pretty trinkets, they likely served as identity markers for trade, like ancient business logos. Now for the quirky tidbit one. Seal shows a figure seated cross-legged, surrounded by animals, looking suspiciously like a prototype of Shiva, the Hindu god. Was it an early deity, a meditation pose, or just someone showing off their yoga game? Before yoga was trendy, archaeologists still scratch their heads. And here's the scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether these seals were purely economic tools or held ritual power as well. Were they stamped on goods like receipts, or were they amulets imbued with spiritual meaning? Without the key to their script, we're left holding beautifully carved mysteries like locked doors without keys. Move to another workshop and you'd find shell bangles being shaped, polished until they shone against the skin. Terracotta figurines, often women with wide hips and elaborate hairstyles, emerge from kilns. Are they toys? Fertility charms? Dolls with the same messy fate as all children's toys, left underfoot and stepped on until their arms broke off? Their exact purpose remains a question, but the fingerprints pressed into the clay remind you that they were shaped by human hands, not distant myth. You stroll past the faint outlines of kilns, feel the ghostly warmth of furnaces that once fired pottery and bricks. The air would have been thick with smoke, the rhythm of hammering and chiseling blending with the chatter of workers. It's the hum of creativity, where imagination met necessity and where skill turned raw materials into goods that spoke of culture, status, and beauty. And all of this craftsmanship fed into something larger. The city wasn't isolated. These seals, beads, and bangles traveled outward, riding on boats and caravans crossing deserts and seas. Mohenjo-Daro's artisans weren't just making trinkets for neighbors, they were shaping objects that linked them to the world stage, even if they never left their brick-lined streets. As you pause in the quiet one, last thought slips in: the artisans themselves remain invisible in history. No names, no signatures, no boasting about who carved the finest seal or drilled the tiniest bead. Their creations outlasted their identities, leaving us with beauty but no biography. Maybe that's why the city feels so haunting. The work is here, but the workers are gone like whispers lost in the wind. And since we're keeping this sleepy, here's your joke for the night. Imagine an Indus bead maker time-traveling into a modern jewelry shop. He'd probably scoff at mass-produced plastic bracelets and mutter, "Really, that's what you're wearing? I drilled this carnelian bead for 3 days straight." From the hum of workshops, your path winds toward quieter chambers, those believed to have housed the dead. It feels a little eerie, though not in a horror movie way, more like a gentle whisper from lives once lived, now folded into the earth. Unlike Egypt, with its pyramids, or Mesopotamia, with grand tombs, Mohenjo-Daro leaves only modest clues about how its people treated mortality. Yet those clues hint at a culture that cared deeply about the final chapter of life. Archaeologists uncovered burials scattered across the city's ruins. Bodies were usually laid in simple brick-lined graves, often with a few goods beside them: pots, beads, bangles, sometimes a shell ornament. No treasure hoards, no golden masks, no extravagant monuments, just everyday objects, as if the dead were being sent off with the familiar comforts of home. Here's the mainstream historical fact: skeletons at Mohenjo-Daro show careful burial practices, with bodies placed in extended positions and accompanied by pottery and ornaments. It suggests respect and ritual, even if understated compared to other civilizations. Now for the quirky tidbit: a few skeletons were found with strange traces, unusual positioning, or odd signs of exposure. One famous claim, though controversial, was that some bones bore signs of sudden catastrophe, like intense heat or radiation. It's fringe speculation, often tied to wild theories about ancient nuclear blasts. Mainstream scholars roll their eyes, but it's proof that even quiet burials can inspire loud imaginations. And the scholarly debate lingers. Historians still argue whether Mohenjo-Daro had formal cemeteries or if burials were scattered throughout neighborhoods. Some evidence suggests designated burial grounds. Other finds point to people being interred close to home. Without written texts, we can't know if there were rituals, chants, or prayers spoken over these graves, or whether death was marked more quietly, folded into the rhythm of everyday life. You pause in the stillness, picturing a funeral procession 4,000 years ago. Neighbors gather carrying jars of water and flowers. A body wrapped in cloth is lowered into the grave, and beads are placed gently beside it. The mourners might sing, or they might simply stand in silence, the only sound the rustle of wind across the baked earth. The city hums on around them, markets clatter, kilns fire, but here time seems to slow, acknowledging the passage of one life back into the soil. The graves are modest, yet that modesty speaks volumes. In a culture without ostentatious kings or boasting inscriptions, perhaps equality stretched even into death. No towering tombs, no carved hieroglyphs declaring greatness, just the quiet statement that all lives, no matter how ordinary, were worth marking. And in the half-light you feel a strange comfort. These people lived, laughed, worked and worried, and when they died they were laid to rest with the small tokens of their world. Beads, bangles, pottery objects meant not to dazzle future archaeologists, but to ease a final journey. Before you leave, here's a gentle joke for the night. Imagine explaining modern funerals to an Indus villager. So yes, we print pamphlets, rent limousines, and hire people to play the bagpipes. They'd probably raise an eyebrow and reply, "We just gave Grandma her favorite bead necklace and called it a day." The graves fade from view, and you find yourself drawn back into the beating heart of the living city, the bustle of daily routine. It's easy to forget that behind the big structures and mysteries, most of Mohenjo-Daro's story was written in ordinary gestures: kneading bread, sweeping courtyards, watching children play until the sun dipped low. To really feel this city, you have to walk through the humdrum moments. Imagine a morning here. The sun rises over flat rooftops, the air still cool before the heat builds. A woman crouches by a hearth baking flatbreads on a clay pan, the smell nutty and warm. Children run barefoot through the courtyard, chasing a dog that looks like it's had enough of their antics. A man heads toward the well with a rope and jar, muttering about how the neighbor borrowed his best pot and still hasn't returned it. The details are mundane, but they give the city texture. Here's the mainstream historical fact: Mohenjo-Daro's residents relied on wheat, barley, and lentils as staples, supplemented by fish from the Indus and meat from cattle, goats, and chickens. The remains of charred grains and animal bones tell us their diet with surprising clarity. Now for the quirky tidbit: archaeologists found board game pieces among the ruins, suggesting people passed time with games not unlike chess or backgammon. Picture two neighbors squatting in the shade, moving carved tokens, each pretending they aren't secretly furious about losing. Proof, if you needed it, that leisure and competitiveness go hand in hand. And here's the scholarly debate: historians still argue whether Mohenjo-Daro was ruled by an organized government guided by merchant guilds or managed through communal cooperation. With no palaces or obvious kingship symbols, it's hard to know who made the rules. Was there a mayor-council, or did people simply follow shared customs, keeping society running without heavy hierarchies? The silence of the ruins leaves the question open. Back in your imagined day, noon creeps closer. Courtyards fill with chatter as families pound spices, feed goats, and argue lightly over chores. Traders shout from the street, offering new pottery, gleaming beads, or bundles of fresh fish. Somewhere in the background, someone plays a simple flute, the notes thin but cheerful. The air smells of baking bread smoke and sweat, ordinary alive. By evening, the mood shifts. Rooftops come alive as families climb up to catch the cool breeze. Clay lamps flicker, casting soft light over faces tired from work, but still animated with conversation. Children count stars until they lose track. Elders share stories of floods and old ancestors, and the city hums like a giant hive, settling into the night. You realize something comforting: the mysteries of Mohenjo-Daro may never be solved, but the rhythms of its people are familiar. They worried about food, argued with neighbors, sought entertainment, raised children, and found moments of rest. Strip away the centuries and their lives don't feel so different from your own. And before you drift onward, here's your joke for the night. Picture an Indus family's board game night. Okay, Dad, just one more round. Nope, bedtime. Oh, come on, 5 more minutes. Some things, it seems, never change. The ordinary rhythms of daily life soften, and your steps drift toward the city's unseen heartbeat, its connection to the Indus River. Without that great sweep of water, none of this would have existed. The river was the lifeline, the provider of fertile soil, the highway of trade, and sometimes the destroyer that reminded people just how fragile their brickwork dreams could be. Stand now at the edge of where the river once flowed. You can almost hear the steady rush, see boats rocking gently against makeshift docks, smell the damp scent of mud and reeds. Merchants would have loaded goods here, bundles of cotton cloth, sacks of grain, strings of carnelian beads, sending them downstream to meet the wider world. The Indus wasn't just water, it was a corridor stretching from the mountains to the sea. Here's the mainstream historical fact: the Indus provided seasonal flooding that enriched the land with silt, supporting crops for one of the world's earliest urban societies. Like the Nile or the Tigris, it tied people to its cycles, its generosity, and its dangers. Now for the quirky tidbit: excavations suggest that some Indus boats were likely flat-bottomed wooden craft with simple sails, practical, if not glamorous. Picture a weary trader grumbling as the wind dies mid-journey, stuck, staring at the same riverbank for hours. Ancient frustration, timeless. And here's the scholarly debate: historians still argue whether shifts in the Indus's course contributed to Mohenjo-Daro's decline. Did floods batter the city into exhaustion, or did the river simply move away, leaving the settlement high and dry? Water, once a blessing, may also have been the undoing. As you linger by the imagined riverbank, you see fishermen hauling nets, heavy with shimmering fish, their laughter echoing. Children skip stones across the current. A woman rinses clothes in the shallows, her bangles clinking as water splashes upward. Meanwhile, boats creak with cargo pushed by poles or tugged by ropes, heading off toward distant lands where merchants await. The river also carried stories. Travelers arriving from faraway valleys brought news of other peoples, other gods, other ways of life. The Indus was not a boundary, it was a thread, stitching Mohenjo-Daro into the fabric of a wider world. Yet it was also fickle. Floods could sweep away fields, drown livestock, and undermine walls. Each season was a gamble. Would the river nurture, or would it destroy? You can almost feel the hush of evening settling on the water. Lamps glow on the decks of moored boats. The last shouts of traders fade into the steady chorus of frogs and insects. The city and the river breathe together, one feeding the other, both inseparable in their fates. And here's a soft smile to end the moment. Imagine an Indus boat captain today, standing beside a modern cargo ship. He'd squint up at the towering steel, mutter something about overcompensation, and then brag, "Well, at least my boat didn't need GPS, I just followed the river." The murmur of the river fades, and now your feet carry you toward the city's shadows, toward the reasons Mohenjo-Daro did not last. It's a sobering walk, because the bricks remain but the people are gone and their silence begs for answers. Why did such a carefully planned, bustling city fade into dust? One theory lies in the floods. The Indus, generous as it was, could also turn fierce. Archaeologists have found silt layers in the ruined signs of repeated inundations that may have drowned streets and homes. Imagine the frustration of rebuilding your walls again and again, only for the water to rise once more. At some point, exhaustion may have set in, families packing up, seeking higher, safer ground. Here's the mainstream historical fact: evidence of flooding has been uncovered in Mohenjo-Daro, including water-damaged brickwork and layers of sediment deposited across the city. It suggests that water wasn't just a lifeline, it was also a relentless adversary. Now for the quirky tidbit: some skeletons were found lying as if people had fallen, suddenly leading fringe theorists to propose catastrophic events from earthquakes to, yes, bizarre claims of ancient nuclear blasts. It makes for dramatic headlines, though most scholars dismiss it as exaggeration or misinterpretation. Still, it shows how mystery invites wild stories. And here's the scholarly debate: historians still argue whether decline was caused by environmental shifts, invasion by outside groups, breakdown of trade, or a mix of all three. Did the river shift its course, cutting off lifelines? Did drought weaken harvests? Did merchants simply drift elsewhere, leaving the city hollow? Or was it a slow unraveling unnoticed until it was too late? You picture it. Slowly, streets growing quieter, markets thinning, wells running dry. A family that once baked bread in a busy courtyard now debates whether to move on. Children play among half-abandoned houses. Roofs crumble from neglect. The great bath sits empty, its water drained its steps, gathering dust. And perhaps after decades of slow decline, the city was left mostly silent. A few lingered, clinging to memories of busier days. But eventually Mohenjo-Daro yielded to time, its bricks buried beneath wind, silt, and silence. Standing among the ruins now, you realize the city's mystery is not just in how it thrived, but in how it ended. Its people left no grand farewell, no carved lament, no final inscription. Just quiet walls, drains, and beads waiting for someone thousands of years later to wonder what went wrong. Before you step onward, a final light-hearted thought: if the Indus people could see the endless debates about their disappearance, they'd probably shrug and say, "We just moved. Chill out." The silence of decline lingers around you, yet Mohenjo-Daro refuses to vanish completely. Even in its unanswered questions, the city whispers. You wander once more through the ghostly streets, seeing not just what was, but what still stirs in the imagination of scholars, dreamers, and late-night wanderers like yourself. The unanswered questions stretch wide. Who governed this city? Was there a council, or did merchants quietly guide the rhythms of life? Did the people worship gods whose names we'll never know, or were their rituals simpler, rooted in water, fire, and earth? And perhaps the greatest question: why did they leave no written history we can read? The Indus script sits tantalizingly close to understanding, yet forever just out of reach, like a word on the tip of your tongue. Here's the mainstream historical fact: over 4,000 symbols of the Indus script have been discovered on seals, tablets, and pottery fragments. Despite decades of study, no one has definitively deciphered them. Now for the quirky tidbit: one of the most common symbols looks like a fish. Some scholars joke that if the script ever is cracked, we might find out the people of Mohenjo-Daro were just labeling their groceries fish lentils. 2 onions, don't forget, goat milk. Imagine waiting millennia for a shopping list. And here's the scholarly debate that refuses to close: was the script a full language, a proto-writing system, or just a set of symbols for trade? Historians still argue whether we're missing the Rosetta Stone of the Indus, or whether there's simply nothing to translate in the way we hope. Until that key is found or accepted never to exist, the city's voice remains muffled. You walk slowly now past the great bath, the workshops, the wells, the homes. You remember the laughter of children on rooftops, the hum of bead makers, the solemnity of funerals, the splash of water in drains. The city is quiet, but your mind is filled with its echoes. Mohenjo-Daro feels unfinished, as though its story was interrupted mid-sentence. And maybe that's why it lingers, because humans crave closure, and this city offers none. The night deepens and your voice softens with it. And so we come to the wind down, the part where history folds gently into sleep. Let the unanswered questions stay unanswered for now. Picture the bricks of Mohenjo-Daro cooling under the stars, their edges softened by centuries of dust. Imagine the streets empty but not lonely, just resting the way old places do when no one is watching. The river drifts silently nearby, carrying silt and memory. Your breathing slows as you imagine yourself on one of those flat rooftops stretched out on a woven mat. The night air is warm but forgiving. A clay lamp flickers beside you, then fades. Above the constellations wheel slowly the same constellations that watched over the city's builders, traders, children and dreamers. The past feels closer than ever, and yet it doesn't demand answers. It only asks you to rest with it. Let the silence settle now. The city is safe, tucked under layers of earth and time. Its mysteries are patient. They've waited 4,000 years, and they can wait a little longer. You don't need to solve them tonight. You only need to close your eyes, let your body sink into stillness, and allow the whisper of ancient walls to soothe you. Sleep comes slowly, like water filling a quiet pool. And as you drift off, Mohenjo-Daro remains not solved, not gone, but breathing softly in the dark, keeping you company until morning.